and the end of any possibility that what would happen in those countries that define themselves as really existing socialism would in fact turn into really existing socialism. That ended, and it was the end of an era. The Cuban Revolution was certainly a hope for many of us in the 1960s, but it did not spread. The Latin American Revolution generally was a hope for many of us, but it was crushed one country after another. Brazil in 64, Argentina in 66, and again in 74, 75. Uruguay, 1973. Chile, perhaps the most disappointing of them all, in 1973. The failure of the 1968 generation social revolutions in Western Europe and the political renaissance that took place in many of those countries did not make a breakthrough. In France, June 1968 was finally contained. It was a close-run thing, but as they say, of Waterloo. Italy, the hot autumn of 69. Spain, 1975, the crushing of the Portuguese Revolution in 1975. And finally, on a different level of magnitude, finally the crushing of the miners' strike in England in 1984. The use of troops being sent into the coal pits in the 1980s to crush a workers' rebellion there. The crisis and dispersal of the far left in the 1980s kind of served to underline how bad things are gotten. Large Marxist currents, Maoist currents, Trotskyist currents of various sorts, certainly in Canada, big Maoist organizations, particularly in Quebec, which had hundreds, perhaps thousands of members, blew apart. By the end of the 1980s, it was pretty well over. The crisis in the Soviet Union, the end of the Soviet Union, put paid to the Communist Party, which was a shadow of what it had been anyways. So that by the time the war, the first Gulf War came along, while there was mass opposition to it, the kinds of possibilities for a movement began to decline, and we enter a period, I think, after the fall, really, where political parties became discredited. The emergence in place of political parties were mass sectoral organizations, an environmental organization, a peace organization, feminist organizations, gay and lesbian organizations, organizations of every kind, but without a coherent global vision of a reborn society. Lenin had talked about the need for a party, saying that without the piston, the steam that is generated dissipates. It takes something to bring it together. And I think that's an apt metaphor, whatever you think of much of what he wrote. We saw that in Vancouver. The peace movement in Vancouver could put almost 100,000 people in the street in the mid-'80s. But what did it lead to? Vancouver pronounced itself non-nuclear. Okay. But what else? Where did those 100,000 people or 80,000 people go? We saw the proof of that in the 1983 Solidarity Mobilization, the first big neoliberal attack by the Socred provincial government here on the rights of workers, which was met by an unheard of response, the Solidarity movement. But at the end, it was sold out by one guy, Jack Monroe, and his friends backing him, who went up and had tea and cookies in Kelowna at Bill Bennett's house and said, "It's over, boys. Everybody back to work." And the amazing thing is, people went back to work. This was an example of the result of not only the treasonous old leaderships of the NDP and the trade unions, including Communist Party leaders in a number of areas, a certain number of whom would go on to be well thought of politicians at Vision Vancouver, which we'll get to, but they were able to impose their way and call off the insurrection, the revolution, the mass movement, whatever, and there was no alternative organizational center capable of saying no. Even in 1914, there had been small organizations, this tiny little Bolshevik group, a few thousand members, Socialist Party of Canada, not a big organization, but they said no. And in many cases, they were able to build on that. But here, there was nobody to say no, except tens of thousands of people who said, well, I won't get fooled again. That's the last time I'll get involved in that kind of foolishness. And a hatred between the social movements and the trade unions, which goes on today because these things become folklore. Just as in England, there are people who won't talk to the other people next door because of what happened in the general strike in 1926 or in the coal strikes in 1984. Here, you still hear this from people in the social movement. Oh, well, we know about what happened in 1983, etc. So these kinds of defeats, these kinds of betrayals leave a legacy. So today, where are we? I'd say for a moment or two, in the 90s and the early 2000s, there were flashes of lightning and there were some rolls of thunder. The APEC mobilization, Claquot, which had more people arrested for breaking the law. For a few younger people here, it was to prevent logging on Vancouver Island. Over 1,000 people were arrested, and logging was more or less prevented. The APEC thing, Seattle, some important strikes, but it was thunder without rain. And it came and it went. The G20 mobilizations in Toronto in the last few years, anti-war demonstrations on the eve of the Iraq invasion, which mobilized many, many, many people. The Occupy movement a few years ago. But these things come, and there's lots and lots of activity, and then they go away. And there's very, very little left. The notion of a political party as the historical memory of the working class or of any class, because those organizations do not exist or do not exist in any credible form of more than a couple of dozen people, essentially the memory is lost, the experience is lost, and everything starts the next time from zero. And this is kind of where we are. I hate to tell you this, but the left is not in good shape. In Europe and Quebec, there have been attempts to build socialist parties of varying hues. The Nouvelle Parti Anticapitaliste, a new anti-capitalist party in France, the Left Bloc in Portugal, which got 11% of the vote in 2011, the Left Party in Germany, and others that we'll discuss in a panel this afternoon. Green-red coalitions are important. We are honored with the presence of Roger Rachy, a founding member of Quebec Solidaire, and he will discuss the experience there, and Michael Leibowitz will talk about the years that he spent in Venezuela, where something called 21st century socialism has emerged. All these organizations and processes are based fundamentally to one degree or another in the classical model of the political party as it emerged in the 19th century. They all have electoral participation as an important element of their practice. None of them are modeled, for instance, on the Zapatista experience, which was attractive for a brief period to activists, the strategy of not taking power. None of them are fully modeled on the classic Leninist party of the Bolsheviks, or the Guevarist political military organization. So, to some degree, these parties are hybrids that develop from different traditions of one sort or another. In Vancouver, we're faced with a crisis of monumental proportions. Capitalism, in its neoliberal form, is attacking the accumulated gains of the working class and other layers of what is called the people. It's also attacking the earth, which is responding with dramatic shifts in climate, which threaten millions of people, animals, fish, and every other living thing. I just finished reading a book about the last ice age and global warming in around 20,000 BC. And things survive. So it's not going to be the end of life, but life as we know it, that is an interesting question. So A Russian novelist in the 19th century wrote a book and used as its title a phrase that was picked up by a socialist pamphleteer in the early 20th century. The book is called What is to be Done? And I think that we, assuming that there is a we here, the people in this room are active members of society, broadly in agreement that the challenges of capitalism need to be met by something else, need to discuss how to take the pieces scattered about our world and put them together into an effective something. What that something is what we don't discuss. I'd like to provoke that discussion a bit with some questions for us to chat about. Assuming we need an organization that brings people together to create a coherent movement that forces to take those forces, bring those forces together to seek to challenge capitalism, I think there's kind of 8 questions and a bonus question. I'm sure there are many others, but I want to pose those so that we can talk about it in the time that we have. What went so terribly wrong in the 20th century? Why has socialism failed to receive the support of the people who would most benefit from it? I wish I knew. That's the first question. Is there a basis for a post-capitalist society, or is left social democratic reforms as good as it's going to get? And we might as well get used to it. That is, have we missed the bus? What do we do about the NDP? Is it anything but a right-wing remnant of a social democratic party that has abandoned any project other than a continuation of things as they are? Number 4, do we need a political party, or is there some other structure that can achieve our goals? 5, what is the role of electoral politics in creating an anti-capitalist alternative? 6, how do we overcome the differences that separate existing left-wing groups? Not in the sense of a correct line, but in the sense of forging working relationships. Number 7, what can we learn from the experiences of the last 100 years of socialist theory and practice? We still read Marx. Why? Is it worth reading? Lenin, Trotsky, Luxemburg, Gramsci, all these old dead Europeans? I still read them and I find interesting information there. Is it worth doing that, or is there something else we should be thinking, another body of thought that we should be thinking of? And lastly, number 8, before the bonus question, what can we learn from existing anti-capitalist projects? Is there a model, at least in rudimentary form? Is there a model in Venezuela? Is there a model in Quebec? Is there a model in Europe? Is there a model somewhere that we can say, okay, maybe we should do that here? And finally, the bonus question, which is the title of this year's teach-in. If capitalism doesn't work, what does?
If you can change your vote when you change your mind, that is what democracy is all about. Now polling.ca.
Perpetual democracy doesn't mean that you have to vote every day. It just means that you have the right and the ability to vote anytime you want. And that is what perpetual democracy is all about.